The U.S. has one of the biggest and most advanced road systems in the world, over 4 million miles of highways and interstate. When we hop in our cars, we just expect the roads to be there and in fair condition. But what if I told you it wasn't always that way? In fact, there was a time when roads weren't a public service at all. Before the government got involved, roads were mostly private, built and maintained by businesses or associations, and even individual entrepreneurs. And here's the kicker. Some of the most powerful industrialists in American history, ones who built their fortunes on private enterprise, actually sided with the government in the fight over who should control the roads.
It was a battle that shaped how we travel today.
So how did we get from a patchwork of private roads to the highways we take for granted today? Let's get started by going back to the late 19th century. Before private highway associations stepped in, America's roads were a complete disaster. We're talking dirt paths, wagon trails, and barely passable routes that made travel slow, unpredictable, and downright dangerous.
How dangerous were the roads? Well, why don't we ask an expert? In Michigan, there was a businessman and a road engineer named Horatio Earl. Horatio wasn't too happy with the condition of Michigan roads in 1905, and he gave his opinion on it.
Michigan's roads are a quagmire of sand, mud, and clay that trap horse-drawn vehicles and early automobiles alike. And dear Horatio wasn't exaggerating. Local towns were responsible for maintaining roads, but they had little funding or even less expertise. Rain turned roads into mud pits, and winter made them impassable. If you were traveling any real distance, you had to be prepared for the worst. Each and every state had its own approach. Some had plans, some didn't, and none of it was coordinated. Most people think today that the proliferation of the automobile was the reason that we had better highways. But honestly, it didn't start with cars. It actually began with bicycles. Looking at the road that we have here, I want you to imagine trying to ride a bike on roads like this. Early cyclists were among the first to demand better roads, long before the automobile took center stage. Of course, once the horseless carriage arrived, the need for real roads became impossible to ignore. The question was, who was going to make that change?
Well, when it came to the battle for our roads, there were two sides. On one side were wealthy businessmen who wanted to build private highway associations. On the other side were labor unions, farmers, towns. They wanted to have commerce with each other, and many of them were abandoned by the railroad. Stuck in the middle was the U.S. government, and they were protecting a pretty big investment at the time, America's railroad. In fact, for years, they'd been pumping millions of taxpayer dollars into railroad infrastructure.
But the demand for better roads kept growing louder. And when the government wouldn't step up, private entrepreneurs did. Meet Carl Fisher. He was a pretty famous guy back then, and wealthy. He owned a big headlight company with a partner. He was a property developer who was credited with building Miami Beach, Florida. He was even a key investor in a little racetrack in Indiana called the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Carl was a car guy when a lot of people didn't even know what a car was, and that needed to change, in his opinion. So what did Carl do about it? If you've got a car, you've got to have somewhere to drive it. And Fisher had an idea about that too. He had a vision of a privately funded coast-to-coast highway that would connect the nation, starting in Times Square, New York, and ending in Lincoln Park in San Francisco. What did they name it? Well, the Lincoln Highway. The Lincoln Highway Association aimed to make that dream a reality, with funding from automakers, tire companies, and private investors. To put it into modern terms, think of it like this. Imagine if Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk all decided to build their own highways today. That's essentially what Fisher and his partner James Allison did. They launched two major initiatives, the Lincoln Highway and what was later known as the Dixie Highway, which was a combination road from Michigan and Illinois to Miami, Florida. Funny thing to note, both of these highway systems passed right through major investments that Fisher had. And Fisher wasn't alone. Across the country, more private highway associations sprang up. There was the Great Trails Highway, the Old Spanish Trail, and the list goes on. There were over 250 private highway associations by the mid-20s. But with all that expansion came problems. You see, the Lincoln and the Dixie highways were well organized and well funded, and actually improved the roads they touched.
But many other private highway associations weren't so noble. In fact, many con men, disguised as road promoters, saw it as a way to make a quick buck. After all, it didn't take a whole lot to get a highway association going. You really only needed permission from the landholders, a really good sales pitch, and a whole lot of paint.
Many of these so-called highway associations were nothing more than painted bands on telephone poles, marking a supposed route without any actual road improvements. The promoters collected money, made promises, and often vanished before any real work got done.
Do you like to road travel? Or do you like history? Or maybe you just want that special place just off the interstate, but you don't want to take all the time to find it. Well, stick with us, because that's what we do here at Beyond the Exit. We try to find the little-known gems that you can go find yourself, especially on two-lane roads and highways. It's waiting out there just to be found. If you like what you're seeing here and you're getting value out of it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust us, we're going places.
Travel wasn't necessarily free. Tolls popped up everywhere. There was a bridge, cattle crossing, or even a state or town border. Imagine coming to your hometown and having to pay a toll just to get into the city. And it didn't stop there. Sometimes road associations would require a paid membership and a toll just to drive on their road. It wasn't just people traveling on the roads either that paid fees. Local businesses, especially wanting to drive traffic through their towns, would pay fees or memberships to these highway associations to get traffic in front of their building, some of which never really materialized. So I guess you could say what started as a much-needed solution quickly turned into a corrupt pay-to-play mess. Towns that had been bypassed by the railroads welcomed private roads as they brought commerce and business back to them. But many of these roads turned into ways to fleece both the travelers and businesses. So while private roads solved some problem, they created others. And with the introduction of the Model T, many more Americans relied on automobiles. It became clear the country needed a real, standardized national road system.
You might find it shocking, but in 1916, the total amount spent on highways in the United States by the federal government amounted to $10,000. And that was for a study to decide whether or not they ought to do something about the roads.
By 1916, because of charlatans, the Highway Association movement was losing credibility. Many private roads weren't being maintained, and the patchwork system was failing to meet the growing demand for reliable travel. So President Woodrow Wilson signed the first major piece of U.S. road legislation, the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916. The law was aimed to kickstart government investment in roads. World War I quickly diverted resources elsewhere, leaving road construction underfunded and largely stalled. So despite the first step forward for government-funded roads, nothing really changed. So while the government hesitated and private roads began to fail, people cried out. Among them, by surprise, a wealthy group of industrialists that stepped in, not to back private roads, but to push the government to do what they thought they should have been doing all along. These were some pretty big names: Henry Ford, Harvey Firestone, and John D. Rockefeller Jr. Now, it's not like there wasn't a huge public outcry, but these powerful men moving forward tipped the scales, steering the U.S. toward a federal highway system rather than a patchwork of private roads. Yet it took the report of another famous future president and his concerns with our security as a country to make it finally happen. It was 1919. World War I was finally over, and our country was looking to change with the modern times. A series of Army motor convoys set out from Washington, D.C., somewhat as a victory lap to honor our troops, but also as a test of our newly mechanized support system versus our existing roads. Enter a young lieutenant colonel by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower was assigned to the U.S. Army Transcontinental Motor Convoy as an observer for the War Department, documenting the challenges of the long-distance military transport. Led by Colonel Charles W. McClure and Major Brett, the convoy consisted of 81 Army vehicles and 282 men, traveling from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California. It took them over 62 grueling days. Along the way, they encountered impassable roads, broken bridges, deep mud, and constant mechanical failures. All of these woes exposed the dire condition of America's road network. Eisenhower took note of these inefficiencies, a lesson reinforced by his later experience with Germany's Autobahns in World War II. Now, many of you know that Eisenhower made better roads, in fact, roads similar to the Autobahn, the cornerstone of his presidency, as he is generally credited with the introduction of our interstate system. By the 1920s, the decision on who would control America's roads had been made. With the automobile on the rise and railroads on the decline, Congress enacted the U.S. numbered route system in 1926. This was more than just a rebranding. It was a full takeover of America's road network. For the first time, the government numbered highways using a standardized system like Route 66 or US 1 or US 30. They funded major interstate connections. They regulated road construction and maintenance. Needless to say, the private highway era was officially over. It's kind of easy to give them a bad rap, but the question remains, were they failures or were they simply stepping stones to a national highway system? Many of the first federally funded roads followed the exact paths laid out by private road builders. The Lincoln Highway became mostly US 30. The Dixie Highway influenced US 41. And in a way, private roads did win. They just didn't get the credit.
So here's a thought. What if private highways had prevailed? Or what if they coexisted with government roads? I mean, would you pay a fee to drive on somebody else's highway? Or what if they were trying to get your attention where you had a commercial for highway? Or what if you paid a fee every year, like Highway Prime?
Our public road system is really something to behold. But when you think about it, we've all paid a certain amount of toll, so to speak, with our tax dollars. The U.S. government, on average, spends over $200 billion per year maintaining federal roads. America's roads are as big as its ambitions nowadays, not to mention they're aging quite rapidly. In fact, there's going to have to be a large infrastructure restructuring before too long. I guess the next question is, where do we go from here?